and the first of what we hope will be many collaborations between the cathedral, the Office of the Bishop, and the Commission on Ministry to bring some of the greatest minds in the Episcopal Church to you to share their wit and their wisdom. And I know that's definitely what we're getting this morning. I have the privilege of introducing to you the Bishop Neil Alexander. I feel incredibly fortunate because in my time at Sewanee, I got to have Neil not only as the dean of the seminary, but also as a fill-in professor while several folks were on sabbatical each semester. So it is, you all are in for a treat, and I say that from experience. So Bishop Neil is the retired Bishop of Atlanta. You've retired from a lot of things, haven't you?
Yeah. I'm going to do it again.
He is also the retired dean of the seminary at Sewanee, has taught at several Episcopal seminaries, including General. I believe you might have been there at the same time as Richard, or close. By a year, yeah. Okay.
Reputation precedes itself, you know.
Yes, yes.
That's actually why I left, you know. I heard he was coming.
And this is just a taste of what you're going to get this morning. But we're just so delighted to have you here with us. And welcome to everyone who is joining us online as well. It's one of the gifts of this time of COVID is that we've learned how to not have to drive across the mountains to be together. So to all of you who are here, Bishop Neil, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. And let me say I'm grateful to be here, and also welcome to the folks who are joining us online, and welcome to good Bishop here. That's good. Good to see you. I believe we've met, haven't we? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Bishop Edwards, thank you for being here. Let me say a little bit about how all this emerged, and so that you have a little bit of context for what we're going to do today. And when the first call came in about my coming to Denver for the weekend, it was about tomorrow, about All Saints, and perhaps having a few thoughts about All Saints and All Souls and that sort of stuff at the Dean's Forum here at St. John's. And then I think Katie and some others, Tina and whatever, seized on the opportunity to get me to work harder. And so we began to explore some options, and one of the things I know about Katie is stubborn is not the correct word, but determined is probably better. And this afternoon's presentation is sort of a new version of something that she heard me do several years ago and thought that it might be useful for folks to hear, and we'll leave that to your judgment this afternoon. But and then the question became what to do with this morning, and we pretty quickly, I think, landed on the fact that with all the changes that we're going through in our society and as the church, and changes that we're going through personally. And in families as a result of the pandemic principally, but because of all kinds of other things that are happening, which we'll mention in a minute, it might be interesting just to sort of wander into all of that, not with a view toward having it all worked out or having every prediction. As you'll see, I have a issue with predictions, but just to try to put some ideas out there, put some thoughts out there, all of which, in my mind, are debatable. I mean, I was reading over my notes this morning and went, just since yesterday, I'm not sure I think that. I mean, after hearing the news last night, I changed my mind, But that's okay. That's not a problem. The point here is to hopefully stimulate your thinking. And if you came for answers, I hate to disappoint you, you've probably come to the wrong place. But if you came for, I hope, some stimulating conversation and some ideas to roll around in your head and contemplate and try to figure out where you and your parish or you and your family or you and your walk with Jesus is in the midst of that, if that becomes the result, then I will be more than grateful that we have spent the time together well. But that's kind of the sort of background. I understand I have a little bit of space to work with here, and as a teacher, I usually walk around a lot, and it's great for your Fitbit, whatever, to be able to walk around. I also learned to do that as a professor because it gives people time to write things down. That if the professor stands still and just keeps talking and whatever, then everybody just you can't keep up. But if you walk around and stumble a little bit and stop and contemplate the pattern of the carpet and whatever, then they have time to write things down. So I'm not sure how that's going to work this morning, but we'll do the best we can, and we'll go from there. So anyway, to begin with, let me just make a couple of really universal observations. And the clearest one of all, one that will not surprise anybody in this room, it's the same thing has come out of, I would wager, every mouth here, is that things are a-changing. What we are not clear about is to what extent they will change. How far will that change go and then pull back? And what are the factors that will go into that? But I think the one thing we can say in the most bald, clear, unequivocal sense that things are a-changing. Now, that happens on a lot of different fronts. It's certainly happening in terms of politics. And I'm not referring just to the fact that we're seemed to me kind of a 50-50 country in the traditional two-party American system. That's certainly a dimension of it. That's certainly a part of it. But that's I'm not talking about just those kinds of politics. I'm just talking about sort of politics at every level, and how things are really shifting. I mean, I was reading the other day a wonderful article about how things like cities and counties, local smallest forms of our political system, are recasting the way they make decisions and rethinking the way they're doing things. And as you know, in many parts of the country, local politics are not partisan. But for the first time in many places, they're beginning to be. I mean, so all kinds of change in that arena, and social movements. We've been talking in the last year or so, or two or 3 years, on a whole new level of conversation around racism, and it's the toll that it takes in our communities, the toll that it takes in people's lives, the toll that it takes in all kinds of ways, and how do we respond to that, and how do we change our thinking about that, and what's the response to that been? Well, we know some of the ugly response to that, but there's also piles of intellectual response to that, both positively and negative, and all kinds of interpretations and reinterpretations of that. I mean, it's like swimming in this morass of a conversation. But then you think about that for a minute and say, well, now, yeah, there are lots of new dimensions to this, but is that any different from any other social movement? I mean, did we not go through something very similar with other social movements that you think about in the past? And do they have what I call sort of returning cycles? I can remember going through the civil rights movement as a young man in the South in the 1950s and 60s, and we came to certain decisions nationally, and certain things happened, and I sort of naively thought that was over, because we finally gotten the laws lined up right, and so therefore we just assumed that, well, we took care of that problem, it's all fixed now, and we realized we didn't fix a darn thing. We just simply either shuttered it off to the side, or buried it, or renamed it, or thought through it differently, or whatever. But did it actually go anywhere? No. And so then, even though so much of it seems settled, there's that return that comes back around. There are theological names for that. The whole part of the long story of the Old Testament, the long story of the New Testament, the long history of the church, the long history of the people of God, whether you talk about it in Jewish terms or Muslim terms or Christian terms or whatever, there's always that sort of element of the eternal return. It's in colloquial terms, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. but there's always the return that comes back around. And part of that is every generation has to learn the lessons anew. Because our parents learned something or our grandparents learned something doesn't mean we know it. And that will be an important thing to remember as we move on. Also, what's changing in terms of health. I read a wonderful essay the other day in the New York Times about the fact that the American diet is changing. It's probably not changing fast enough for certain people. It's changing too fast for the producers of certain of our unhealthy foods. But there's actually evidence that's beginning to show that the standard American diet is going through a meaningful shift, thankfully, in a more healthy direction. Are we there yet? No. Are we going to probably step back? Or everybody say, oh, now that we're eating healthier, I can have that many more, fill in the blank, hamburgers or whatever, and then, but there will inevitably be that return, that step, and then step back and return, move forward, step back and return. That's an important pattern. You'll understand as the day goes on that I think all this is about patterns. I think everything we do and every way we live is about patterns. And it's about whether we're following them or breaking them, or recasting them, or reshaping them. But ultimately there's a pattern there, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And then we got climate change and health and all those other kinds of things, any number of other things. But today I want to actually lay most of those things I've just mentioned aside. They may sneak back in occasionally, but I really want to talk about this in reference to the pandemic and the pandemic and all that's demanded of us personally and as a community and in whatever ways. 2 things just to say, so everybody knows where I'm coming from, is I am enormously grateful to the scientists. I've now had every shot that they've offered, and I'm prepared to stand in line for more if they have them, and including my shingles shot. Dan, I think will remember when the year that during Holy Week, the Bishop of Atlanta got a horrible case of shingles. And so when my physician said, it's time for you to have the shingles shot, I said, now, like not tomorrow, now. I mean, so I actually believe in science, and I believe it helps us, and it's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. And the other thing I want to say is, as I've kind of hinted already, is I'm a skeptic. I am a serious skeptic when it comes to futurists. And I don't care whether that's a societal futurist, an economic futurist, an ecclesiastical futurist, or whatever. And part of the reason you have to understand I'm skeptical about that is because, my stock in trade is I'm a historian. And as a historian, I've always been better about the past than about the future. I can't read the tea leaves. Maybe there are people who think they can, though I would say as a historian, they've never really been as good at it as they would like to have us believe they are. I'll give you the one that has had the most impact upon my personal vocation in the church over these many decades, and that are the futurists around theological education. The various futurists had argued some decades ago now, back in the 60s and 70s, and into the 80s, and a new group of futurists in the early 90s and whatever, who were all saying, what theological education was going to look like going forward, how it was going to be different from what it had been, and now nobody in their right mind didn't think it was going to change. But when you actually predict what that change will be, and you create a revolutionary kind of model for how you're going to get there, rather than an evolutionary model to walk up upon that change in a natural way. And what was the result? Well, what the result was, and this is the historian in me speaking, but those institutions of American higher education that followed the futurist on that point, those institutions are either closed or are a shadow of their former self. And I can find no exception to that. Those institutions that bucked the trend and said, we don't care, if that's the future that we're running toward, then we're going to run full steam ahead until we hit up against that future, and then we'll do something about it. And those institutions, frankly, are still in business. In most cases, they're strong and vital and thriving and whatever, because they said, if that's what the future looks like, we're not interested. And if we get there and we end up being wrong, we'll deal with it then. And that I will tell you, sisters and brothers. I mean, there's hard evidence around that. I mean, we're not talking about Neil's speculation here. I mean, we can just name them and point to it. And so it's an interesting thing. I think futurists, and I think the futurists about the church. We have a number of people out there who are telling us, what's the church going to look like in the next generation? And what's the interesting thing about that is most of those futurists are my age, and what they're telling us is coming is something that looks an awful lot like what we lived through in the church in the 1960s, which by the time we got to the 1970s was over. And what's more, the people who are half my age or less these days, frankly, don't seem to be much interested in the church that these people are predicting is going to happen. Now, I don't lose any sleep over that at night, friends, because I'm an evolutionist in terms of how human society works. I don't think, as a general rule, the revolution of human beings. I mean, you can have the revolution, but as soon as it's over, we kind of cut back, right? And we revert back to. I mean, look at the what's happened just in the last several decades in Europe. There were great revolutions, Soviet revolutions, and countries under Soviet control and whatever, and then all that comes undone. And what has happened in most of those countries? Well, first of all, they're thriving in a way they had not been thriving in the better part of a century. But more to the point, they have reclaimed their identity. They have reclaimed what it means to live in this part of the world, and to eat food that is grown in this part of the world, and to make stews that we eat in this part of the world. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing to watch. But that's because the revolution got so far ahead of the evolution that when the revolutionary tide let go, what did people do? They stepped back into their place on the evolutionary scale. That's instructive, I think, for where we find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic. But again, that's just the way I think about these things. You probably, or you very well may think about it very differently. So anyway, that doesn't mean we can't learn from the futurists. That doesn't mean we can't look at their data. That doesn't mean we can't debate their opinions and maybe even welcome some new ideas and refreshing thoughts about some of that. But to follow and expect it's going to work out exactly like that, there's nothing that I can see in our history in the church, or our history as a nation, or our history, just as the way people work with each other, deal with each other, in families, that would make me believe that's true. Okay, but as we said at the beginning, things are going to change, and let's just name some of the things that are going to change as a result of all this in terms of the church. Well, I think it's going to change the way we gather. That's pretty clear. I mean, we're doing that as we speak, right? I mean, there are 20 people here or whatever it is in the room, and there are that many people or so online on the other side of Colorado. We would all want to say, though, that this is a gathering and we're all in this together. And that's a positive thing. I mean, I think in the last year and a half, the communities of which I am a part of, because we can be together digitally. And that is a really positive thing. And some of that's, the Friday afternoon Zoom cocktail party with people I wouldn't be in touch with probably otherwise, because we live literally all over the world. But, because we haven't got anything else to do, we have kind of figure out how to do this. So I mean, I'd be the last person to argue that they're not positives, and that we ought to exploit those positives. But the evolutionist in me says, but I'm not sure that is the whole sum of the way we should look at the future. And the reason my ultimate answer is that is because we're human beings. And I'll say more about that as we go along. The ways we interact will be different. I've noticed, one of my friends and colleagues, a former vice chancellor at Sewanee, he used to sit in meetings and like the vice chancellor's cabinet, the senior officers of the university, about 15 of us. We'd sit around the table, and the boss would be down at the end of the table. He'd sit there with his arms crossed for a period of time, and he would listen intently. I mean, the man was an incredibly good listener. And then at some point, he would lean forward in his chair and sit up and go, "It seems to me that everything that needs to be said has been said, but it's not clear that everyone has had a chance to say it." Which was his way of actually cutting off conversation in a humorous way. But there was actually something to that. And one of the things I've noticed in meetings, we can get a whole lot more done on certain kinds of meetings on Zoom because we tend not to repeat each other in the same way that we repeat each other when we're in the room. But there's a downside to that too. Conversations on Zoom often don't evolve like they do when you're in the room, precisely because, Katie gives an idea and Richard responds to it with a little different nuance, and then Tina responds to Richard with another little nuance, and then Broderick responds to that with another little, and it takes a while for that idea to kind of ferment and mold and whatever, and then by the time this conversation's over, that kernel idea that was first put on the table has now blossomed into something we can work with. I think, from my own observation, spending hours, some days as much as 12 hours on WebEx or Skype or Zoom or something. That's not a commercial for Zoom. But it's much harder. It's sometimes easier to get to a quick resolution, but it's much harder for an idea to ferment in that kind of context. But that's just to say it's going to be different. And one of the questions I ask is, I keep asking people is, if not that doing some of this digitally is not a help to us, but if it's some way it diminishes the fermentation factor, then where and how do we, if we're going to make wine, it still has to have time to ferment. And that takes human contact in a way that I'm not sure the digital thing does. It helps, but it's not a complete substitute. Okay. The other things, I think roles are going to change. I think clergy roles are already changing. I think we spend a lot of time in the House of Bishops talking about what being a bishop means in this particular time and place. I don't mean this particular time and place, but I mean in our own time is different from what it was even 20 years ago when I became the Bishop of Atlanta. And it was really different when I became the Bishop of Atlanta than it was 20 years before that when my predecessor became the Bishop of Atlanta. Just what fundamental leadership means. shifts and changes. And I think this whole pandemic thing, it shows all the evidence of changing that again. And the structures of our communities will be different going forward. But let me say quickly that because those structures will be different and because some of us are going to have to learn new ways of doing things and whatever, doesn't mean, and this is an important point, does not mean it will not be recognizable. You know, one of my favorite stories about this principle, some years ago, the seminary community at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio, it's the seminary there historically is a merger of the old Hamma School of Theology, which was German Lutheran in background, and the Evangelical Lutheran Seminary of Ohio, which was more Scandinavian, Swedish and Finnish and all those things, you know, Scandinavian, that's the word I was looking for. And so it's two different flavors of Lutheranism, okay? Which is why they had to have two seminaries in Ohio, you know, I mean, we have two different flavors of Lutherans, we got to have two different flavors of seminary, right? Okay, but, you know, as time went on, they decided to merge the two and make one seminary. And that's not the story. The story is that when they moved into their new quarters, one of the things they had to do was to build a new seminary chapel. And so they decided, well, we're not just going to throw up a building. We're actually going to take the time, and they laid out a 5-year plan of conversation and study and historical study, theological reflection on what it means to worship as a seminary community, and how is that different from a parish church, and how is that different from perhaps a cathedral, and how is that different from from a monastic community, and so forth, and then we got to talk about, you know, what are the particular kind of values that we want to uphold in this particular seminary's worship life, that we want to model for our students as they go out into parishes and lead worshiping congregations, and blah, 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 you know. And so they had laid out this 5-year plan, and then at the end of the 5-year plan, they turned all this over to a group of really very thoughtful and very sensitive architects and liturgical designers and whatever. And then a year later, they come back, and there's a picture of the building and a picture of the floor plan and a picture of all the auxiliary space, you know, sacristies and bathrooms and all those other kinds of things that Christians have to have. And what was so phenomenal about that was no one on earth would mistake those pictures for a church. I mean, I think that they went through this process assuming that you know, what came out in bricks and mortar was going to look like some other thing. And it came out looking like a church. And they have a font, and they have an altar, and they have an ambo for the reading of the word and the preaching, and they have some flexibility so the offices can be done differently from the Eucharist, and Holy Week can be accommodated without a whole lot of compromise. And in the corner there was a pipe organ, you know. I mean, but there was this kind of expectation that they were going to create something wholly new. Now, I think it was probably incredibly a gift to that community to go through that process. But it was no surprise to anybody when the building was built. You drove by it and went, church. You know, and but my point is there's human reality in that has to be taken account of. Okay. So, a couple of other things, and this is back to a little bit to my hobby horse on futurists, but I think it may help put some of this in context. One of the things that I like to talk about is God's future. I mean, my whole theological way of operating, my whole theological system, if you want to talk about it that way, the sort of a core pillar in the way I think about our life together and think about life and Christ and salvation and all those other, the whole thing from my vantage point requires a pretty serious theological affirmation that God has a future. Now, I'm sure that that's driven at least partially by when and where I grew up. But, I grew up, when there were people talking about, is God dead? Now, I later learned as I was growing up and growing up in the faith that the whole God is dead thing. A couple of the people in that God is dead movement back, and I remember when the front page of Time magazine, God is dead. I actually taught seminary with one of the principal people in that group, and he no more believed that God is dead than the man in the moon. He was a very faithful disciple of Jesus, as faithful a human being as I've ever known, loved the scriptures, and taught them with a mastery that few people I've ever known have been able to do. The man was extraordinary. But what he meant by God is dead is he said so much of the church talks about God and talks about these things in past tense. We talk about an old rugged cross on a hill far away, but we don't spend very much time talking about the meaning of that cross in this moment, but perhaps more importantly, that it has a future. He would rail in class about the fact that he said, I get so tired of going to church and listen to the preacher talking about Jesus in past tense. If he in fact is risen from the dead, we can talk about him in present tense. And we can perhaps even talk about him in future tense. So my point simply is that as we go through this particular historical moment, as we are shaped by the particular difficulties of these present days, thinking about how we navigate them from a theological standpoint, it seems to me, is more than heavily dependent upon, do we really in the core of our souls believe that God has a future? That there's something toward which all this is moving. And that the very fact that God has a future animates the possibilities of the present moment. If the present is where I often try to describe it, if the past and all that has been, the mighty acts of God recorded in the Old Testament, the history of the people of Israel, the history of the church, the sufferings, death, resurrection of Jesus, the ascension. If all that stuff that is in historical past is rushing at us in this direction, and God's future is rushing at us in this direction, and they meet in this moment, then we have to be conscious of the fact that this moment is birthed by the nuclear explosion of the collision of all that has been with all that will be. And we so often talk and treat the present moment as though that collision is not even in view, much less having happened. But the question here is, if God has a future, then to what are we being drawn? To what are we being pulled? The other thing I want to say, and this is not just a caveat about anything I say today, but it is a caveat about whatever I say today. And I believe that because of the situation we're in, and that we're in this collision moment between all that has been and the rush of God's future, and that every answer is provisional. Every answer is provisional. It may suggest, I've already said it once this morning. When I said earlier, I said, well, I was looking over my notes this morning, and there were a couple of things that I think I might have changed my mind about since yesterday. Why? Because every answer is provisional. Now, this kind of pushes me toward a bias that I might as well own as a teacher. You know, nothing, in all the years I spent as a seminary professor, nothing drove me crazier than students who wanted the answer. I mean, you know, I could care less about the answer. Well, maybe that's a little strong, but I mean, except on my exam. I mean, there are answers there that I want to see, but no. But seriously, you know, I think it's so important to understand that most answers, and especially when we're talking about something as dynamic as the power of God pulling us through toward God's future. I mean, how could anything be anything but provisional? But it's the answer for today. You know, it's not the answer necessarily for tomorrow. And which I believe, I mean, that's not just like some, you know, harebrained idea. I mean, that's all caught up in some sort of doctrine of the Holy Spirit. You know, if the Holy Spirit is constantly dynamically teaching and urging and poking and prodding and whatever and moving us forward, then at the very least the vantage point is going to change. You know, it's we just have to, you know, we have to think about that. And then the next one is are we prepared? And this is a question that may be slightly oriented toward the clergy, but not entirely. But are we prepared to take the risk of imagining that we might be asking the wrong questions? You know, I mean, that's one of the lessons that, I mean, I think at some level I've kind of always known that, but if the last 18 to 24 months of this pandemic time and all the stuff that, you know, we won't get into the details, but what I have been through myself in thinking through this with people and thinking through it on my own, and how does this relate to my vocation and retiring and all those other, I mean, you know, am I in fact asking the right questions? But that all goes, I'm sure I'm weak to that, because all of my teaching years tells me that the greatest gift you give to your students is help them understand ever more deeply the depth and breadth of the question. They have a lifetime to begin to formulate a provisional answer that over their lifetime will change. You know, having been in ministry as long as I have, I mean, you know, I say this to the clergy in the room and online. I hope that if you haven't already, you will develop the discipline of never, ever, under any circumstances, throwing a sermon away. You know, whether you keep it digitally or keep it on paper, I don't care. But I mean, don't ever throw one away. Not because you're going to come back to it and preach it again. Though, you know, if you keep it and you need to look for the story about the duck, at least you'll have it. You know, so I mean, there is that positive. But seriously, the reason for that is, in the life of a preacher, there is no better source of spiritual autobiography than to read your old sermons. And, you know, I go back to something I preached in 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in my case, 40 some years ago. And I look at some of that stuff and I go, I don't believe I said that. I cannot fathom that came out of my mouth. I cannot fathom that I wrote that down so it might come out of my mouth. Right? But when I do that, then that's not about despair. In me, that creates some sort of unutterable joy, because it's testimony that the power of the Holy Spirit has continued to work in me, continued to change, continued to form and reform, that my understanding of the Scriptures has gone through chapter after chapter after chapter of reformulation as I got better at it and knew more and discovered more and thought more and saw relationships now that I didn't see then. And I'm willing to admit that relationships I saw then don't exist. I mean, it's just amazing. What a gift it is. So, it keeps us tied to the journey. So here is the question of the morning. What motivates me, and what I'm going to spend the rest of this morning talking about? How are we doing? Not well. Okay. What motivates me is to ask not what is going to change, but rather what is likely to stay the same. Or at least, as I mentioned in the story about the seminary chapel, what's at least going to remain in some way or another recognizable. That's where I want to go here for a bit. And I think this approach is vitally important for people of faith. What are those things amid the huge upheaval, predictable unpredictability with an orientation toward disorientation? Can we count on holding on to? As I mentioned already, we'll get back to God later, but I'm banking part of this on, my whole way of thinking about this is focused on God's future and what that means for what we're going through. The next thing, though, is so we'll talk about God later, but if we have time, and God will understand if we don't, because God is not worried about God's future, as Neil might be. And so, but here's the thing. If you don't hear anything else I say today, hear this. I want to use so much of what we've learned in these last 2 years. Have you noticed how that's gone? The rector a year ago was talking about the last 12 months. Then it was the last 18 months. And now we're coming up on 2 years here, It's like, oh my God. And I don't want to be dismissive of any of the things we've learned. And I do believe we have some tools to do some things in a more effective way than we have been able to do in the past. But ultimately, friends, people are just people. And there are certain things that are going to be driven by our humanity, or perhaps better, our humanness, that we are going to have to learn to continue to navigate. Will some of them be different? Yes. Will it demand different things of leadership? Yes. Will it help us form different patterns? Yes. But those human factors will be there, and I want to talk a little bit about what they are. I believe it's one of the fundamental things that makes Neil Neil, at least above the shoulders. I believe, with no caveats, that human beings are fundamentally ritual creatures. Now, I'm not talking about liturgies there. In some tertiary level, I may be talking about liturgies or something like that. But I'm just talking about the way we draw breath and live our lives. We are fundamentally ritual creatures. Some of those rituals are biological. Some of those are physical. Some of those are relational. Some of those are communal. Some of those are vocational. Some of those are spiritual. Some of those are driven by the proclivities of our own personalities, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, or where you are on the Myers-Briggs type indicator. There are personality traits that influence how one navigates and moves into the rituals that make you you. but there's still those rituals that make you you. Some are driven by society and societal norms. Some of those societal norms are positive, and some of them are negative. They are driven by the web of relationships with others from our most intimate relationships to our most casual relationships. You know, I don't know anything about this person other than I see them frequently at the grocery store, and they recognize my face and I recognize theirs, and we kind of nod. From the most intimate to the most casual. Our ritual patterns are the building blocks of who we are. And life, here's my definition of life. This may or may not be helpful to you, but it's my definition. Life is the daily navigation of the ritual patterns that tie us to everything from the fecundity of Mother Earth to the future of God. And how we navigate between those two poles is about ritual patterns. So, let me ask you then, if you don't have to buy any of this, but if in fact I'm right about that, then why do we feel so anxious these days? Well, there's a pervading sense of disorientation. There's a certain discomfort as we go about our days. And why is this anxiety abroad in our land? Well, surely there are lots of answers to that, and I'm confident more answers than the few that I'm going to kind of point to. But I believe the biggest thing that COVID has done is to be a disruptor of our ritual patterns. And that's everything from your personal, only you ritual patterns, to that with your significant other where that's relevant, to with your children where that's relevant, with neighbors, with friends, with parishioners, and with people with that you do business with. You know, the clerk at the King Super or whatever. Or the various other places where that happens. Why is there an anxiety? Why this? It's because it's a disruptor of ritual pattern. Okay, so let me ask then, can you name a ritual pattern in your life or in our common life in the church? Can you name a ritual pattern that has not been disrupted? I mean, really. Think about it. Okay, I mean, I'll just name a few. And this list is like, 1/100th of the possibilities that could be on this list. But think, these are just the big ones. Working from home. Now, there have been a few people that have, worked from home because of the nature of what they do or, whatever. But the vast majority of us worked in some sort of more community environment, corporate environment, office environment, building environment. I mean, some place where, work meant getting together with other people. And particularly working at home for an extended period of time. And we've all said, well, I'm going to work from home on Thursday because I've got to finish my sermon, or whatever. We've all done that sort of stuff. But the other 5 days of the week you were in the office, or at the hospital, or doing those things that people do. I think another one, it was so funny, this happened at the B&B, the lovely B&B that I'm staying in down the street here. It was the breakfast conversation yesterday about all the people around the table who had spent their business life in the last year. And we had accountants, we had a bishop, we had an artist, it was a very diverse group of people vocationally. And actually diverse in other ways too. But what was so cool about that is we got on this absolutely hilarious conversation where we were just carrying on about being dressed on Zoom, and people having something that looked like the appropriate professional attire from here up. But they were wearing, their underwear and barefooted under the table or whatever, and there's no, but I did the whole thing in a tracksuit with a bow tie, it's like it was just on and on and on, all these, just that disruption, I heard people talk about, I'm now going back to my closet for the first time in 18 months and nothing fits. Because I've either put on the COVID-20 or I've taken off the COVID-20. And different people have responded differently. But in either case, that old blouse won't work anymore, or that old pair of trousers won't work anymore. Simply, but we didn't know that because that pattern of putting them on every third day had been disrupted. The whole thing about eating out. In restaurants being closed. That was this morning's conversation at the B&B. How many restaurants and places that we've lived are no longer? And what does that mean in terms of the disruption of our societal pattern? And now that some restaurants are filling up again and going back online, let me just test this, at least in the room. I can't see the hands on the thing, but I can see the hands in the room. How many of you? Most of you have been around a while. Going to a restaurant was probably not a high anxiety exercise. But remember, after 6 or 8 months or whatever, and then going into and not quite knowing how to behave, and I still have, depending on the restaurant, I've gotten to where I can navigate, certain places okay, but there are still restaurants I go in that I wouldn't have thought a nanosecond about navigating 2 years ago, But now I go in and I say, okay, now, should I sit here? Should I sit there? How long should I keep my mask on? When can I take it off? Is it okay to drink alcohol in this place? I know they offer it, but should I really? It's just it's just madness, and so forth. Neglect of health. One of the other is, staying home for the holidays. Not celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, and other human occasions with the people that, people say things to me like, I haven't not been with my mother on her birthday ever in my life. And now my mother has had 2 birthdays alone because of the inability. That's a huge ritual pattern in that person's life that has been disrupted by this. Well, in 2 people's lives, frankly, but disrupted in different kinds of ways, and so forth. And then, of course, you have all the other stuff: shutting down sports arenas, concerts, theaters, dance halls, museums, libraries, on and on and on. All those things that contribute powerfully toward making us human and making us a human society. I don't want to suggest anything causal here, but I just find it interesting to think about, and again, I have no answer to this, but just to think about how the rise in violence in parts of our country and in certain communities and around certain kinds of issues has increased at a time when so much of what would typically occupy us has been unavailable. Where I come from, college football is a religion. We had a whole season where the team played kind of a half season in most cases. They didn't play every game they normally would have played, but they played to an empty stadium. Now, okay, there were a few people watching on television, but the 108,000 people that normally would have been at Sanford Stadium that afternoon had to find something else to do. And that was a major disruption, not just of the gate, but a major disruption of even the pattern and ritual and flow of those people's lives. And that disruption is, something's going to have to substitute for that disruption. Now, again, I'm not arguing that that's causal or anything like that, so don't go say missing football games makes people violent. That's not what I just said. But I can't help but wonder about the rise of violence and the rise of things that wouldn't normally happen in the absence of a whole bunch of stuff that would normally happen. And if the connectivity of those outlets, again, I wouldn't want to argue causality, but the coincidence is too delicious not to think about it, at least. Anyway. So I argue that the disruption of human patterns is the root cause of anxiety, not only for individuals, but for systems, for families, for neighborhoods, for congregations, for cities, for states, for nations, and I suspect we could even add dioceses to that. But the systems that we create and we disrupt the human ritual patterns, and the result is increased anxiety. I mean, think about the last 2 years. If you had to name the emotion that most of us have lived through, or the feeling, if you prefer, that most of us have lived through, when you go down that list of possibilities, I suspect, if I gave you 10 options of words that might describe how we've lived through this last couple of years, and one of those 10 words was anxiety, I would bet that 95% of you would circle that one. Oh, sadness would be on there, disruption might be on there, a few other terminology, but I bet when you saw anxiety, that's where the pencil would circle as the most accurate descriptor of the result of the disruption. So think about this in your own case. I love this. Your own ritual pattern at the beginning of the day. Now, I don't want to get too graphic here, but I suspect if you're like anybody else I've ever met, and you all look fairly normal, so I think I'm probably onto something here, and that is most of you probably have a fairly predictable morning ritual pattern. Now, they're not all exactly alike, but I bet they share a lot of the same things. You get up and you go to the bathroom. You search for your bathrobe. You put on the coffee pot. You let the dog out. If you don't have a really smart dog, you go get the paper. I had a lab at one point who'd go get it for me, which was a particular season in life that I've never been able to return to, but nonetheless, and get the paper, and then if you have children to feed in the morning to get off to school, there's probably some patterning in how that works. Your son hops out of bed with no problem, but your daughter is going to sleep till the absolute last moment. That's the way it was in my household, but that affects how the whole morning thing in the kitchen goes, and the whole dance around the bathroom goes, and all of that sort of stuff. It's sort of like being back in New York there with the A train. It's like but there's probably some sort of morning routine there, right? There's some sort of morning ritual that you go through. Now, have you ever had one of those days when you say, I keep having to remind myself that today is Tuesday because I keep thinking it's Thursday. Well, why is that? Well, the ritual scholars would tell you that's because the likelihood is something in your morning routine did not go as planned. There was something about that this particular day which was more like Thursday than Tuesday. Similar to that, they've done studies on things like, what about, people say, now this assumes a normal 40-hour Monday through Friday work week in this particular research, but they figured out that what is for people who work 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, what's the most stressful day of the week? Most people would probably say Monday. It's actually Saturday. And the reason it's Saturday is because part of what makes Monday through Friday sustainable is that you have a sort of pattern that you do. I mean, there's a particular way all that unfolds. But Saturday, there is no pattern. Now, at some level, that sort of feels freeing, that you can sleep an extra hour, and that you can make a little fancier breakfast, and that you don't have to worry about screaming at the children to get them out of bed. They can sleep as long as they want to, unless they have a 7:30 soccer game, or whatever it is. But yet, what the research shows is that is actually more stressful at the end of the day, because you have relinquished your ritual pattern on that Saturday, and you don't have that to kind of hang on to. The other thing that they were looking at is vacations. Here's, oh, thank God we're on vacation and get a time to relax and time to whatever. But then they also figured out that about 3.5 days before the end of the vacation, your stress level begins to go up again, because you're beginning to think about your reentry at work, you're thinking about the drive home, you're thinking about the grocery list because the cupboard is bare because you've been at the beach for a week, or whatever it is, and so but basically he said, the last 3.5 days of your vacation, you're really reestablishing your patterns, so that when you are home, you can. But my point is, it just simply points to there's certain ways that human beings function, and it's going to be very hard to let all of that go, and so forth. We're getting a little behind here, so I'm gonna skip a little forward here. So anyway. If in fact you're with me and believe that there's something to these ritual patterns, when ritual patterns get disrupted, then I want to ask, when the ritual patterns of our life together in Christ get disrupted, then what are we going to do about that? My response is, again, I think we use the tools and the resources of our new reality when that's appropriate. But, someone asked me, several have asked me several times of late, are people going to come back? And my answer to that is yes. Now, exactly the same people? Maybe. Are a few going to be by the wayside and are going to stick online or do something else? Sure. But I'm also encouraged, frankly, by I was reading a story the other day of a person who basically joined a congregation during the pandemic online, because they knew that they needed some spiritual nourishment during this time, and most of the churches in their community, this was a community in New Jersey, that were closed, but they searched and they found this particular church, and I'm happy to say it was an Episcopal church, and they got into regular daily office with some other members of the parish. They went to the Sunday liturgy online, which was basically, sermon and dry mass, and whatever. But it sort of became a part of the community, and engaged and whatever. And then the story was about just only about a month ago, as the parish was beginning to open up. A person who had become a very faithful member of the community was actually going to the building for the first time. And they had made arrangements for somebody to meet her at the door. So she said, well, show her her church. The physical manifestation of her church, right? And she was thrilled, and she couldn't wait. And it's a bunch of stuff in the story about, oh yeah, I got to meet Grace, and Grace was this little lady who often read the scriptures on Wednesday morning online at morning prayer, and Grace is only 4 feet tall. I thought she was probably 6'2" on television, but just on and on and on. And I said, yeah, people need each other. And there's a kind of, we ought to look at our digital world as a gift for the gift it brings us, but it is no substitute for the fact that the people of God as human beings are going to be together. And what is the answer to that? Because they're human beings. We are wired to community. We are wired to fellowship. Now, we can do classes online. We can do certain prayer exercises online. We can do certain things online. But ultimately, but why? And so when somebody says, well, how do we navigate this transaction? Well, the way I want to argue that we navigate this transaction is to let go of institutional maintenance and focus to the greatest degree possible on helping people be as fully human as they possibly can be, and do that as a ministry of Christ. Because what do we know from our theological tradition? Is God wants us to be fully human. You know, as Irenaeus of Lyon used to say, the glory of God is a human person fully alive. So I want to say, all right, so what can we as a community of faith do to promote fully alive in relationships, in every area of life? How can we help people do that? Well, I've got a couple thoughts about that. One of the things is that, you know, to the greatest degree, the digital world is two-dimensional, sight and sound. Right? We've had some experiments. You know, I had a little group. We got together one day, and we all made sure that we had fresh flowers and good beverages, so that we had taste and smell to go with the sight and sound. Right? It was just an experiment. We were just kind of playing around, you know. But the idea was, you know, if we're going to be fully human, we've got to feed all 5 of our senses. And I'm going to argue in a minute there's actually 6, but nonetheless, we got to feed all of those. And can we give somebody a full human experience of all that God hopes and desires for them to be in only 2 dimensions? And my answer is I don't think so. Can it help? Yes. But can it substitute for the other 3 or 4? I don't think so. And so, you know, and so just, you know, and this is why the sacraments have been so important through the history of the church. It is because, I mean, you know, the church centuries ago figured out that we got to appeal to the human side, to the people's senses. So take touch, for example. Water of baptism. You can actually feel it. The oil of chrism at anointing. The oil of healing at a time of sickness. The laying on of hands. You know, I can't tell you how many people, I've never actually looked at my hands as being particularly big, and because I'm a keyboard player, I was always grateful to have shorter fingers, because shorter fingers are actually more controllable. You know, everybody thinks that people with big hands are better keyboard players. Actually, the great pianists all have small hands. But just a little factoid for the morning, all right? But anyway, but now where was that going? Hold on here. I know. But when I was bishop, people used to say, I would see them like 3, 4, 5, 10 years after their confirmation, and they'd say, you know, I don't remember anything about your sermon that day. I don't remember a whole lot about the service. But the one thing I can still feel simply by naming it is your hands boring into the top of my head. You know, I can just talk about it and feel your fingers. And I thought, okay, well, I mean, I think that's a fabulous example of the point. And also, exchange of peace is another one. You know, think about salt. Not salt. Think about taste. You know, one of the pieces we lost, and I'm not arguing that we should restore it. This is the sort of thing that Bishop Edwards and I would sit in a pub at House of Bishops meeting and talk about. But I don't know that we'll ever win this conversation. But you know, for much of the church's history, one of the things that happened to your baptism is that the priest stuck a finger in a little salt thing, a little salt. What do you call those things? Cellar. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. And then touched the child's tongue with a few grains of salt. Now, it was thought of as the salt of exorcism. We get rid of the spirits here, so that when the Holy Spirit of God in the water and the resurrection of whatever happens here in the baptism, we've cleared the deck with the salt, basically. I mean, it's a cleansing agent, right? And so, but the fact that gets experienced by taste. It's kind of a cool thing to think about. And then, of course, we got bread and wine at the Eucharist and all these things that we taste. And think about smell. The sweet odor of baptismal chrism, the wafting of the incense in parishes that do that, the pungency of an Easter lily. I've been fascinated by those parishes that just absolutely we will not have incense in Easter, that we can't stand incense, and yet that's probably the parish with the highest per capita number of Easter lilies that you can smell from the parking lot on Easter morning before you get anywhere near the building. The lingering smell of Murphy's oil soap from the custodian having cleaned, or lemon pledge, I had a friend, he's gone to glory now, but he was the archdeacon of the Diocese of West Virginia, which in their system was kind of like the canon of the ordinary. But when he would go visit these little congregations all over the hillsides of West Virginia, he would get there early and ask the senior warden to meet him a half hour before the meeting, and they would walk through the church and walk through the parish hall and walk through the Sunday school rooms, whatever they had, big churches, little churches, whatever. But they would take a physical tour of the building, and as they did, Bill would walk around and he'd go, then he'd go in another room and he'd make a note. He went through the buildings and smelling things. And then he would report to the vestry. And he said, I hate to tell you people, but I smell death. There's nothing here that makes me, that gives me any sense of life. Or you go to another parish and he said, y'all are small, your budget's tight, we're having a hard time finding you a priest, but you're going to be just fine. Why? Because I walk around here and I smell life. It's clear that y'all been cooking in the parish hall, and I don't know who you've been feeding, but there's life there. And I can smell over here that I don't know whether that's one child in Sunday school or 50, but there's clearly something going on here, and I can smell it. And I think about my childhood growing up in the church. I don't have any olfactory association with Holy Week and Easter. Now, this is from my childhood. But I have an olfactory association with Christmas. Because, my parish church that I grew up in had a distinctive odor between the mix of the fresh cedar and the very pungent little narcissi that they decorated around the altar with. And because it was a Moravian church, we were having love feasts, which means that for hours before the service, they had been in this huge copper pot in a big paddle. They were making coffee with cream and sugar that was simmered for hours, so it had a particular flavor, but it just pervaded and so the cedar plus the narcissus plus the beeswax of the Christmas candles plus the coffee plus the sweet rolls for the love feast, whatever. This sort of cacophony of odors, and as far as I'm concerned, that's Christmas. That is the Christmas odor. And I can't do that online. Whatever. And now I could go on seeing and hearing and all that other kind of stuff. Let me say something about, with hearing, obviously there's the big stuff like church music, there's hearing the word proclaimed, the hearing the text of the liturgy, and a lot of that, of course, can be, to some degree, done online. But, one of the things that, one of the pieces, one of the things I have been conscious of missing in this time when we were not gathering is the shuffling of feet. The shuffling of feet for me is a sacramental thing that goes into my ears. One of the reasons I hate churches with carpet is because you can't hear the shuffling of the feet. and why I love a good wooden floor that creaks, or a stone floor that click, or that, where you can hear the grit under people's feet or whatever. That is sacramental to me. That sort of hearing that shuffling. Think about it. The shuffling of feet going to be fed on the risen life of Jesus. Watching people and hearing people's feet shuffle as they go to be fed is itself sacramental. Okay, and then we can go on. Let me talk about the last one. There are 5 senses, and we could give plenty more examples, but I said there was a 6th one, and I actually believe, and this is because I'm probably a liturgist and I'm a ritual scholar, and this is the kind of stuff I lay in bed worried about at night. But I think, and the 6th one I want to mention is not really a sense, but it is vitally important. It is extraordinarily important to our formation, and that is movement. And I mean by that bodily movement. And from the most elemental of like getting up and getting dressed and getting in the car and going somewhere to a big building with all these other people. First of all, there's that movement, which, by the way, I believe is a highly political thing. The very fact that with all the possibilities, all the different ways you could spend this particular hour, that you're going to actually physically take yourself and put yourself in community with these other people to do something, whatever that something is and say, I take my stand with these people. That's actually a political act in the best sense of what political means. Not partisan, but in the terms of being of the nature of the community. It is a big part of it, but also movement. When you think of let's think about the ritual. There are processions. There you come in and you kneel down and you pray, and then you stand to sing, and then you sit to listen, and then you maybe make the sign of the cross at various places in the service, or you bow your head at certain places in the service, or you reverence the altar. And that can be in places where there's a minimal amount of that to places where there's just constant amount of that kind of stuff. Or think about the priest at the altar. There are all sorts of gestures and movements and so forth that interpret and underscore and underline and invigorate and deepen and thicken what's happening there, right? And in the expression of those movements, I think it's one of those aha moments in life when you have been a part of a ritual community. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a religious ritual community or whether it's could perhaps be some sort of civic club, or it could be a sports club, or it could be, but a community that at least partially defines its life by certain movements. And when you first become a part of that community, you just do them. It's sort of almost rote. It's obedience. It's like, and now I'm supposed to do this. But then there's that moment that I believe happens for all of us, when that movement actually you recognize has connected to the deepest part of your DNA. And it's no longer, I've got to bow my head when the cross comes by. That's an intellectual transaction. Here comes the cross, I must go. But after you do that for a while, then all of a sudden, almost without noticing, the cross comes by, and you. When it has transferred to the internal part of who you are. So my appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the mercy of God, is that as we think about moving toward God's future, we take with us those good things we've been given and learn, but that we really spend our time and our energy brainstorming ways that we can help people in the name of Jesus for the fullness of their life in Christ be more fully human. I just had one or two thoughts about that, and then I'm going to stop. But go back to touch, okay? In baptism, we have water and oil and all that kind of stuff. But I want to ask a question: Who needs in your community to be touched? Now, obviously, we mean in appropriate ways, but who needs to be touched? Who needs to be bathed? Who needs to be oiled? And I don't just mean in a time of crisis. I mean, I remember when I was at St. John's in the Village in New York as a priest associate while teaching at General, one of our parish ministries that just warms my heart every time I think about it is we had the rockers, as we called them. Who were the rockers? The rockers were mostly retired members of the parish, a few other people, but who had definable days off that they could support the ministry of the rockers. But just up the street from St. John's is the New York Foundling Hospital, where to this day there are trays like bank depositories where you can open it and put a baby in it and close it, and the hospital staff will take it from there. You know, and that was a big deal a century ago, but even now, they're still there and they're still functional and they are still monitored. So if somebody finds a baby or doesn't know what to do or just is at their wit's end or whatever it is, they can just take the baby and put it in there and punch the button and the nurses will come and take care. Well, what this means is the New York Foundling Hospital, even today, has dozens of babies there. And the nursing staff, as faithful and as good as they are, cannot spend that much of their shift touching the babies. I mean, they've got stuff to do, They got to make sure they're well and feed them and all those kinds of things that the nurses do. And so in the nursery, there's a whole line of rocking chairs. And members of the parish would go up there and take a baby out of the bassinet and throw a towel over their shoulder and go rock that little sucker for an hour. Because that baby needs to be touched. That baby needs to be held. That baby needs to be rocked and caressed and sung to and pull his ears or whatever, I mean, the baby needs to be babied. And so that's the kind of question I'm asking. Who in your community needs to be touched? Are there babies that need to be rocked? There's a guild in one parish I know in the Diocese of New York, upstate New York, and there's a fairly large state-operated nursing home for elderly people, but that means that again, the staff, this is not down on the medical staff. The medical staff are doing their job as well as they can, but there's certain sort of extras that the medical staff never gets around to. And so there's a guild at this parish that goes down to the whatever the thing is called a couple of times a week, and they consult with the nurses about this, that, and the other, and then they help bathe these people. And so they get some warm water, and they get clean hair, and somebody brushes their hair, and whatever it is, and I thought, well, so my question is, we touch people in baptism, that's pretty important sacramentally, but where are the other places that make sense for a group of Christians in this time to push the conversation forward and try to touch people? We have laundry ministries, bathing facilities, volunteering in a public nursing facility. I mean, there are all kinds of things. And then I think of things like sight. How do we? Are there ways in which we can help people see? I can think of one in Atlanta. There's this group at St. Luke's Atlanta downtown. And St. Luke's, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but they have unusually fine stained glass. I mean, in a class by itself. There are very few churches that I can name that come anywhere close to St. Luke's when it comes to stained glass. And what does St. Luke's has a ministry of going out to, not only nursing homes, but various group homes for people who are challenged in a variety of different ways, but are kind of confined and whatever. And they bring them to the church, and you generally feed them a meal or feed them some kind of coffee hour stuff or something, But I mean, some hospitality. But then they get to spend the afternoon in the church, looking at the windows, having things pointed out. I mean, they live in buildings and in communities and in housing where there's nothing pretty to look at. And so the people at St. Luke's sit there and tell them Bible stories and say, now see, that was Jesus when he was being baptized, and see the water coming down and blah, 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 blah. I mean, just to give these people's eyes a feast and thereby make them more human. A gift to their humanity. And we could talk about gardens and feeding programs all the rest of the day and so forth, but friends, I'm sure you get my point. The question is, we shape ourselves in the likeness of Christ by our exercise of the sacraments of the resurrection that we access through our senses and through movement. And if that's doing for us what I believe it's doing for us, and the question that I want to have is, in our mission and ministry and as we grow into this new future, what can we begin to do together? And I believe that calling people to do these things together will re-knit and reunite us. So, who needs to be touched? Who needs to see things that they otherwise couldn't see? Who needs to hear what they otherwise couldn't hear? If you're cooped up in a group home, maybe you need to be taken to a concert or something. I don't know, whatever. How can we do these things? How can we feed people's humanness in the name of Jesus? That'll make us better. It will strengthen the church at every level. And it will bring God's future in that much more quickly. So, that's all I've got to say, which took me a little bit longer to say than I thought it would, but whatever. And I will be glad to respond, answer questions, or just sit down and shut up, whatever you prefer. So.
Microphone if you do have a question so everyone can hear it. I think the microphone is on, Dirk. And we do have a question from one of our online folks.
Sure.
The Reverend Michelle Danson asks if you would define your understanding of the difference between ritual and routine.
Who is this from?
Her name is Michelle Danson. She is clergy here in Colorado.
Okay, the reason I was asking, that's a distinction I often make in class. I was just wondering if it was a former student. Setting me up, thank you for that question. No, that's good. Okay, well, I'll tell you how I think about that, yeah. The difference, the principal difference, I believe, between routine and ritual can be defined in this way. Routine is something that I habitually do, but if I quit doing it, I don't miss it. Whereas a ritual, I do repeatedly, and if I stop doing it, or if it is in a large way disrupted, like in many cases COVID has been for some of us, for all of us. If I miss it, then that's what makes a ritual. And why is that distinction important? Well, because I miss it indicates that it is at some level, maybe that I can verbalize, but maybe I can't verbalize, but just feel or have an inkling about. If I miss it, then at some level, it is formative of me and who I am and who I am becoming. And the example I used to sometimes, give in class was one of the things I do routinely is take out the trash. But and by the way, I never thought about this until just this second. But I now live in a building where we have a trash valet, so I don't have to take the trash out anymore. They come and get it every day. I pay $30 a month, and they empty all my trash cans every day. And I have not suffered one iota. I have not missed it. And therefore, that says to me that, I may have been faithful at taking out the trash, but it was not a particularly formative thing in my life. Whereas, when I quit doing this other thing, I miss it, so then I recognize it as one of the building blocks that make me me. So that's the way I would make the distinction. I hope that's helpful. I think I can probably come up with something better than taking out the trash, but I'll work on that. Something else. Someone else has something we want to think about or debate or whatever. This is the fun part of the day.
Yeah, so when I came to my church, I'm at All Saints. I'm Cynthia Espeseth, and I'm the rector at All Saints in Loveland. When I came to the church, actually my first interview with them, I asked what color of choir robes the choir had. And I was met with dead silence. And they said, well, our choir doesn't wear robes. And I went, okay, I can go with the processing choir without robes. That's cool, low church, but all right, that's all right. Oh, but our choir doesn't process.
You hear that one coming, right?
Right, and I went, oh, which was really fascinating because it was otherwise an incredibly formal church. Things have moved on. We've done some chancel remodel, made it more accessible, and now the choir wants robes. Mm-hmm. So as I'm listening to you talk today, what I'm hearing is this longing to come back to a ritual that has been had in other places, but not in this place together. Can you talk a little bit about reclaiming ritual from other places and bringing it to the now?
Yeah, I think I can say a sentence or two about that. Yeah, I think. I first want to say that I believe that communities need to work toward and search out and figure out their own rituals. Now, in a tradition like ours, in an Anglican tradition, an Episcopal Church tradition, there are certain things that we kind of recognize in each other. And maybe they're not mandatory or whatever, but and so a parish adopting something or letting something go is not. The question I would have is it particularly authentic to this particular community and whatever. I remember there's a little parish that I served for a while in New York City as an interim. And the thing that used to drive me crazy, and it was a perfectly fine church and wonderful people and a perfectly fine facility. I mean, there was nothing overtly wrong, but they wanted to be St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, and they wanted their choir to sing like St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, and they wanted everything to be like St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, but they were All Saints Bloomingdales. There was nothing about them that was ever going to be St. Thomas Fifth Avenue. And it didn't matter what kind of choir robes they had, what kind of organist they had, it was never going to be St. Thomas. It just wasn't, And so part of what we try to do in the interim is help them understand, okay, what's authentically All Saints? Now, it'll have some of the same thing. The preacher will wear vestments. We'll use the prayer book. We'll sing out of the blue book. There are a lot of the outward and visible stuff's going to be the same. But even the building itself demanded a level of adaptation. We didn't have as many steps as they have going up to the altar at St. Thomas. So falderall on the steps had to change. I mean, there's just certain dances you couldn't do at All Saints on the, with the acolytes and with the crucifer and the incense and what. I mean, there's a limited amount, So finding the authentic thing for them. Now, but I mean, I think it's actually a human response, though. In some cases, they. One of the things I used to rail about at Sewanee when I was all the years I was there. Was and I say this in a way I'm sure it's not going to sound like I want it to sound, but I used to just torture the chaplains and the people at All Saints Chapel because they were kind of caught in between two worlds. One is they exist to be the chapel for the university community, and that's principally students. And so, what does that mean in terms of how we embrace the tradition? But the other thing that place is terrorized by is because it is Sewanee, because it's the university for that part of the country, because it's a little bit of an Episcopal theme park, and then people come visit, and they go to chapel on Sunday morning at All Saints, and they just assume that that's the way the world is supposed to be, so they go back to Mobile and terrorize the rector because she's not doing things like the chaplain at Sewanee does them, because the way they do it at Sewanee is the right way. Well, now there's nothing about that that's true. but you see the problem?
But this is the opposite. This is a goodness that's happening, because what I've had is, like, everybody that's in the choir is new to the choir in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And they are wanting to reclaim
Yeah,
an identity as a result of having had to be stuck in this two-dimensional worship.
Yeah.
They have seen each other, they've prayed face-to-face two-dimensionally, and now they want to kind of rid that lar.
Yeah. I think I would probably. Well, okay. Here's another way of thinking about this. One of the things we know about the way ritual works is when the ritual of a community does not feed the piety of the people will invent something to replace it. That's like rule number 3 of liturgical development, right? I mean, that's what explains singing Christmas trees, palm crosses, decorated crosses, etc. I mean, there's a whole list of things that are sort of para-liturgical things that get overlaid. Birthday cakes for Jesus on Christmas Eve. I mean, there are all kinds of things that get overlaid on the liturgy. But what that really tells you is not, it's no help to judge the para-liturgical thing. What you need to do is think, what is it about the ritual that is not feeding the people sufficiently? What is it about the Christmas Eve liturgy that's not working that makes them want to have cake? And so, but to your point, but also, because Saint whatever it is has never had vestments before, or never had choir robes before. There may be some historical reasons for that. They might be economic. A former rector might have studied with Marion Hatchett. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that may never have happened. But then places evolve. As I said, I have little use for people who think in terms of revolutions around these matters, but natural evolutions happen all the time, and I see no reason to suppress them. So but what I think the cool thing would be, if I could go one step further, is in your position as the rector, it would be to think, and I'm not sure I have the answer to this, but to think, how can I have the conversation with them about this so that we really understand what's really happening here. So in other words, it's not really about the robes, probably.
No.
Yeah, it's about something else. We are. I mean, and I don't mean this like it's probably going to sound, but people respond to certain stimuli in ways that they often can't verbalize. And so, I don't know that what I'm about to say is true, but let's just say there's just something in the way you preach or something in the way you preside that that makes them yearn for something. I mean, they see a new richness in the way this liturgy unfolds that they've never experienced in previous priests. And that makes them all the more hungry for more. And that's what this is manifesting. But the cool thing would be to have that conversation. So not that just that you learn, but that they learn that there's this, that the Holy Spirit's doing something here, people. So, and it's not just about what color the choir robes are, but that's just simply an outward invisible manifestation of this deeper thing that's happening.
It's coming at the same time we're having a bunch of new musicians come forward from the congregation and start playing offertories and preludes, and it is very much a spirit-led. There's something new going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I wouldn't do anything to get in the way of it.
No, not at all.
I wouldn't get, not get it in the way of it at all. Yeah, so. Anybody else got something burning to get off their chest or whatever? Okay, well, we do have a couple more minutes, but we don't need to use them if we don't have to. There goes the dean. I'm in trouble now.
So, Neil, one of the things I was thinking about as you talked, I think as we've seen the interruption in these ritual patterns, we've also seen an increase in the verbal. So, somebody said the other day, we have more access now to words than we ever have through the internet. We certainly, social media, we experience more people's kind of words and pictures than we ever have just on a normal given day. And I wonder if that's a part of it, of the anxiety then that we feel, because we're processing just so much through the kind of the verbal political. We're thinking so much about what all this means. And I wonder if that's a part of the anxiety, is the loss of the nonverbal.
I think it is, but yes, I think that's exactly right. But what that reminds me of, Richard, is that with the lightning speed of everything that's happening, and the lightning speed of digital communication, and if war breaks out this morning and wherever on the other side of the world, we can watch it on TV live. And I want to say really loudly, what's wrong with that picture? But anyway, but what I think is killing us at another level is that while our technology and a lot of other things push us at record speeds, I see no meaningful evidence that we can adjust any faster than we ever did. And I think human beings need downtime to think about stuff, to process stuff, and this business of wanting an immediate reaction. I remember the day I told the clergy of the Diocese of Atlanta, I said, if you send me an email, and it's something simple like, we're meeting at such and such for lunch at noon, that's fine. But if you want a thoughtful response, if you want a response right now, I can pretty much tell you the answer is going to be no. But as your bishop, I want to get to yes, because I want you to feel good about it. I want you to be empowered by it. And I want you to be transformed. I want to find a way to get to yes, if at all possible. But if I have to give you an answer this minute without having a chance to think about it and try to think about what the unintended consequences might be, and try to think about how this might affect other parishes, or try to think about some of the other things, if I have to answer you right now, it's just going to be no. Mm. But if you give me a couple of days, I'll work my way to yes if you'll let me. Yeah. Well, but I think that applies in so many areas. It's like the 24-hour news cycle. You don't have a time to breathe. It used to be that you listen to Huntley Brinkley or one of those, from 6:30 to 7 in the evening, and you would sort of take in the day's news, but then you could kind of think about it overnight, and then you could talk about it the next morning at the water cooler, and then you could chat with it over lunch with your buds or whatever, and then you got the next episode, later, and so, I don't think, we were reasonably well-informed public, but we had process time.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that's killing us in some cases on online education, because we can feed the stuff so quickly, the student doesn't have any time to process. Yeah. We learned this with all kinds of online education and stuff in the School of Theology at Sewanee. We had to figure out ways to slow down the digital delivery to give them time to think about it. Because if we just continue to it's just, they've got to have time. Human beings have got to have time to process. And that's one of the dangers and downsides of this whole thing, And we're reducing the process time, and I think it's making us sick. I think it's making some of us crazy, and I mean that in a clinical sense. And certainly keeping anxiety in our communities and parishes and even families at a higher level than it needs to be because of the speed at which things happen and no time to process.
Yeah. And just as a quick follow-up on that, I agree. It's a difference between information and wisdom.
Yeah.
And the piece on the time makes me think about that's one of the beauties of the liturgical year. We get to do this again next year. We don't have to figure out the mystery of Easter.
Well, that's why in my model, God's future is so important. Yeah. Because what we don't get done today, there's tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or there's, the whole theological principle there about the Eucharist is we celebrate the Eucharist today, but guess what? We can do it again next Sunday. Why? Why? Because we have every confidence in the world that God has a future and will still be active next week, and the week after, and the year after, and the decade after, and the whatever. It's a different kind of economy of how you think about and use time.
Right.
But
that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll call it quits at this point, and everybody can have a little bite to eat. And those of you online, it's been wonderful to see you, and we'll see most of you, I take it, at some point this afternoon. You have some announcements you want to make, Tina?
For those of us and are coming back this afternoon, our wonderful communications team has put together this